The sky above Drakemoor Peaks had been empty for 140 years. No wings, no shadow crossing the sun. Just a long, slow, polite emptiness that everyone in the 6 surrounding kingdoms had learned to call normal. And on the highest ridge of that emptiness, on a cold evening in late autumn, a 28-year-old man named Eron Thalveris stood at the cliff's edge with both hands open at his sides, and he listened to a silence that was about to end. You would not have looked twice at him, dear viewer. He wore a weathered leather coat patched at both elbows. His boots had been resoled 4 times. His silver white hair, which he had inherited from a grandmother nobody alive remembered, was tied back with a leather cord that he had cut from an old saddle. His eyes were the color of warm amber, and they were tired. He had not eaten a hot meal in 3 days. He had not spoken to another human being in 11. And he was, by every official record in every court that bothered to keep records, the most useless man alive. Because Eron Thalveris held a title. The title was Dragon Tamer of Drakemoor. It was hereditary. It had been in his family for 9 generations. It came with a stipend. A small stone keep on the lower slope, and a single ceremonial obligation to watch the mountain, to listen to it, to be present in case the mountain ever needed someone who knew its name. And for 140 years, the mountain had needed absolutely nothing. Because dragons were extinct. Everyone knew this. Children learned it in school. Scholars wrote books about it. The last confirmed sighting had been a juvenile drake glimpsed over the northern sea in the year of the long winter. And after that, nothing. Silence. A polite, complete geological silence. And so the 6 kingdoms that surrounded Drakemoor, Vale, Corim, Fessenmoor, the Reachlands, Old Bracken, and the free cities of the Hollow Coast had, one by one, very quietly, stopped paying the stipend. Vale cut it first, 12 years ago. Corim followed. By the time Eron turned 25, no kingdom was paying anything at all. His title was a joke. His keep was crumbling. His wife, a kind woman named Alari, had packed 2 trunks and a child and gone home to her father's house in the lowlands because she could not feed their son on ceremony. Eron had not blamed her. He had walked her to the bottom of the mountain pass himself and kissed his son's forehead and told the boy to grow up gentler than the world deserved. And then he had walked back up. He had stayed because his grandmother told him to. Hold on, dear viewer, because that sentence is the entire engine of what is about to happen, and you need to understand it before the dragons wake up. Eron's grandmother, a woman named Eron Thalveris, had died when Eron was 9 years old. She had been bedridden for the last 2 years of her life, and during those years, she had made him sit beside her bed every single evening and memorize 3 words. They were not words in any language Eron recognized. They had a shape in the mouth that felt older than Spee. We'll never use these. You will never say them aloud. But when the mountain asks, you will know how to answer. Promise me. He had promised. He had been 9. He had not understood, and for 19 years afterward, he had carried those 3 sounds in the back of his mouth like a key for a door he did not believe in. So when the kingdom stopped paying, and Alari left, and the sun left, and the courts stopped sending the ceremonial envoys who used to come once a year just to laugh at him, Eron stayed, because a dying woman had asked him to, and because, every now and then, on certain very still evenings, he thought he could feel the mountain breathing under his feet. This evening was one of them. He stood on the cliff's edge at dusk, and he raised one hand toward the empty sky out of pure stubborn habit, the way his father had done, and his grandfather had done, and his great-great-grandmother Vesa had done. And then he stopped, because something deep in the mountain, something very far below the stone he was standing on, answered. It was not a sound, it was a pressure, like the slow, enormous exhalation of something that had been holding its breath for a very, very long time. The pressure rolled up through his boots, up the bones of his legs, up his spine, and into the base of his skull. And in that moment, dear viewer, every hair on his arms stood up, and his amber eyes went wide, and he understood, finally, with absolute and terrifying clarity, what his grandmother had been telling him to wait for. Something beneath the stone was awake. He stood there for a long time without moving. The sun finished setting. The first stars came out. The wind picked up and pulled at his coat, and he did not feel it. He just stood and listened to the pressure that was not a sound, and he thought about his grandmother's bedside, and he thought about his son's gentle forehead, and he thought about the empty sky, and he thought, I am going to need help. And here's where it gets crazy, dear viewer, because at that exact moment, 14 miles down the southern road, a caravan of 17 wagons was already moving toward Drakemoor with drilling equipment, mercenary guards, and a contract signed by Trade Baron Verthel Karst-on-Hollow of the Free Cities. The contract authorized the extraction of what the document called __quote_0__. The mercenaries had been told the mountain was empty. The drillers had been told the same. Verthel himself had been told, by his geologists, that there was almost certainly a sealed magma chamber under the eastern face, and that the chamber contained ore that had not been mined anywhere on the continent in living memory. He intended to be the first person to mine it. He intended to become extraordinarily wealthy, and he intended to have it done before anyone in the Six Kingdoms noticed. He had not factored in Eron Thalveris, because Eron Thalveris was, on paper, a joke, a man who guarded an empty mountain, a man whose wife had left him, a man whose title was a punchline, the kind of obstacle you removed with a bribe or a polite letter, or, if absolutely necessary, a single arrow. The caravan reached the lower slope of Drakemoor at dawn. By that point, Eron had been awake for 2 days. He had not slept since the pressure rolled up through his boots. He had walked every path of the mountain he knew, listening, and the pressure had become, slowly, 3 pressures. 3 separate, enormous, breathing presences layered inside the rock at different depths. He could feel them the way you can feel 3 different people in a dark room, even if you cannot see them. And he was beginning, in the back of his throat, to feel the shape of his grandmother's 3 words tugging at him, like dogs on 3 different leashes, wanting to be spoken. He was sitting on the front step of his crumbling keep, eating a piece of stale bread, when he saw the dust. You have to understand what a caravan looks like from the front step of a crumbling keep on a mountain that nobody visits. It looks wrong. It looks like a mistake in the geometry of the world. 17 wagons, 40-some men, iron-banded crates, long bundles wrapped in oilcloth that Eron recognized, with a slow sinking in his stomach, as drilling rigs, the kind they used in the deep mines of the Hollow Coast. And riding at the front, on a black gelding with silver fittings, was a man Eron had never seen but immediately understood, a trade baron, velvet collar, soft hands, the face of a man who had bought every difficult problem of his life and was confident he could buy this one too. The man dismounted at the edge of the keep's broken courtyard. He did not bow, he smiled. "Quote 1, he said, in a warm voice that did not match anything in his eyes. Eron looked at him for a long, slow moment. He looked at the wagons. He looked at the drilling rigs. He felt, deep under his boots, the 3 pressures shifting, stirring, listening. He felt his grandmother's 3 words tugging at the back of his throat. And he understood, with a clarity that almost made him laugh, that the universe had a sense of humor. Because of course the mountain had waited 140 years to wake up, and of course it had chosen the exact week when a velvet-collared man with drilling equipment was rolling up the southern road. He did not invite Verthel inside. Instead, he said, very quietly, "There is nothing on the eastern face that you want, my lord." Verthel's smile did not change. Eron said. Verthel laughed politely, the way you laugh at a child. He gave a signal. The wagons began to roll past the keep toward the eastern slope. Mercenaries flanked them. Eron stood on his front step and did not move. He could not stop 40 armed men. He had no soldiers. He had no allies. He had a title that was a joke, and a grandmother's 3 words, and a mountain that was breathing under his feet. He watched the caravan disappear around the ridge, and then he sat down on the step and he put his face in his hands. And for the first time in years, Eron Thalveris asked the mountain, out loud, what it wanted him to do. The mountain, of course, did not answer in words. The mountain answered 3 hours later with a sound. The drill bit hit the sealed chamber at roughly midday. The sound that came out was not the sound of stone breaking. It was the sound of stone exhaling, a long, low, geological breath that rolled down the eastern face of Drakemoor and across the valley and into the village of Ashen-Hollow at the foot of the pass, where 17 people felt their teeth vibrate, and one elderly woman dropped a pitcher of milk. In the keep on the lower slope, Eron Thalveris was on his feet before the second breath came. By the third, he was running. He ran the goat trail up the eastern ridge. He ran past the place where his grandmother used to take him to watch the sunrise. He ran past the cairn where his father was buried, and when he came over the lip of the ridge and saw the drilling site, he stopped. The mercenaries were already running away. Several were screaming. The drilling rig was on its side, smoking. Verthel Karst-on-Hollow stood frozen at the edge of the borehole, with his velvet collar undone and his soft hands pressed against his mouth. And out of the hole, out of the chamber his contract had described as a deposit of extinct mineral resources, 3 sets of eyes were rising, slowly, sleepily, patiently. The first set was the color of warm amber, just like Eron's. The second was the color of struck bronze. The third was the color of a sigh, pale and silver and ancient. The 3 pressures Eron had been feeling under his boots had names. The names were sitting in the back of his throat. And as the 3 sets of eyes rose into the daylight for the first time in 140 years, they turned, all together, slowly, with the precise unanimity of an old ceremony, and they looked at Eron Thalveris. And then, in a gesture so small that only he saw it, all 3 of them inclined their enormous heads. The dragons bowed. Hold on, dear viewer, because this is the moment. This is the moment that breaks Eron's life in half. Before this moment, he is a man with a useless title on an empty mountain. After this moment, he is the only living person in the world who knows the names of 3 apex predators that the 6 kingdoms believed could not exist. And he understands, in the half second between the bow and the next breath, that his grandmother did not give him 3 words to use. She gave him 3 words to be responsible for. The mountain does not need a tamer. The mountain needs an interpreter. And he is, suddenly, the only one. Verthel Karst-on-Hollow saw the bow. He saw the dragons defer to a man in a patched coat. He understood, in his velvet-collared way, exactly what he was looking at. Not a guardian of an empty mountain, but the single most valuable human being on the continent. And his soft hands stopped trembling. And he started, very quietly, to think. That night, in the keep, Eron did not sleep. He sat at his grandmother's old kitchen table with a single tallow candle, and he wrote, on the back of an old stipend ledger, the only honest sentence he could think of. I do not know what to do. He stared at it for a long time, and then there was a knock at the door. Her name was Lyra Vance of Ash. She was 19 years old. She worked at the stable in Ashen-Hollow at the foot of the pass, and she had, for as long as Eron could remember, been the only person in the village who did not laugh when his name was mentioned. She had climbed the goat trail in the dark, alone, with a satchel of bread and dried apples and a small clay jar of honey her mother had pressed into her hands without explanation. She stood in his doorway with leaves in her hair and her cheeks red from the climb, and she said, very simply, quote, 7, Eron, who had not been looked at with that particular kind of attention in 11 years. Did not know what to say. He stepped aside. She came in. She put the satchel on the table. She saw the sentence he had written. She read it. She did not laugh. Quote 8. Quote, she said. Quote 9. Quote. And that, dear viewer, was the moment Eron Thalveris gained his first ally. Not a soldier, not a wizard, a stable girl with bread and honey who refused to be afraid of him. She would, over the course of the next year, become his witness, his scribe, his second pair of eyes, and the single person in the world he could trust to tell him the truth when his own head got too loud. But on that first night, she was simply a young woman at his kitchen table, eating dried apples and listening to him try to explain, for the first time out loud, the 3 words his grandmother had taught him. He did not say the words, not yet, but he described their shape: the low one, the bell-bright one, the sighing one. Lyra listened with her chin in her hands and her eyes very serious, and when he was finished, she said, "Quote 10. Quote 11. Eron said. Quote 12. She said. Quote 13. He looked at her for a long moment, and he realized, with a small, sharp, embarrassed shock, that a 19-year-old stable girl had, in a single sentence, understood the thing his entire bloodline had been trying not to forget. He was not a master. He was an interpreter. The dragons did not obey. The dragons consulted. And his job, his real job, the job his grandmother had been protecting from the kingdoms and the courts and the laughing scholars for 19 years of bedside whispers, his job was to listen first and translate second, and command never. Over the next weeks, while Verthel's surviving mercenaries straggled down the southern road and word began to leak across the 6 kingdoms that something had happened on Drakemoor, something that the official reports were calling an industrial accident and the unofficial reports were calling, in low voices in taverns, a sound the old people remember, Eron and Lyra began what neither of them would have called training. It was not training. It was apprenticeship. Eron was the apprentice. The dragons were the teachers. Lyra was the witness who wrote everything down on the backs of the old stipend ledgers, because if either of them died in the next year, she said, somebody should know what had actually happened. The eldest of the 3 dragons, the one with eyes the color of warm amber, the one whose name was the low sound that vibrated in the chest, did not leave the chamber for a long time. She, and Eron understood after the first week that she was a she, would only raise her enormous head into the daylight at dusk. She would look at him. She would wait. Eron would speak, not in her name, he had not yet dared, but in plain words. He would tell her, the way you tell an old relative who has been away for 140 years, what the world had become. He would describe the 6 kingdoms, the trade routes, the wars, the fact that her species was, in every book, in every classroom, on every map, listed as extinct. And the dragon with the amber eyes would listen, and her enormous lid would close slowly over one eye and then the other, and Eron would feel, not hear, a sound in the base of his skull like a long, low note of grief. The second dragon, the one with eyes the color of struck bronze, the one whose name was the sharp, bell-bright sound, was younger, less patient. He emerged from the chamber on the 4th day, looked at Lyra for a long time, and then took flight in a single enormous wing snap that knocked Eron flat onto his back and scattered the chickens of Ashen Hollow 11 miles below. He returned at sunset with a deer he had not eaten. He laid it at the entrance to the chamber. He looked at Eron. Eron understood, with a small, embarrassed laugh, that the deer was a gift, an offering. The dragon was, in his own way, asking permission to be here. The third dragon, the sighing one, the one with eyes the color of silver, did not emerge for a month. When it finally did, it was at night, and Eron and Lyra were sitting at the mouth of the chamber with a small fire between them, and the silver dragon simply lay down beside the fire and put its enormous head on its forelegs and closed its eyes and slept. And in the firelight, Lyra reached across the small space between them and took Eron's hand, and he let her. And neither of them said anything for a long time. And dear viewer, I want you to hold that small image in your mind, because it is going to matter later. A stable girl, a forgotten tamer, a sleeping dragon, and a single small fire on a mountain that the world believed was empty. But the world, of course, did not stay fooled for long. By the second month, the first scouts arrived. They came from Vale, 3 riders in unmarked gray. They camped on the lower slope and watched the mountain through long brass tubes and made notes and rode away. A week later, a delegation from Coram. A week after that, 2__quote_16_ from Thessenmoor, whose merchandise was, suspiciously, entirely composed of empty crates. Eron did what Lyra advised. He let them come. He let them watch. He showed them nothing. He met each delegation at the door of his keep, in his patched coat, with his amber eyes very tired, and he said the same sentence to all of them. It was a lie. Every kingdom knew it was a lie, and every kingdom, for now, allowed the lie, because none of them yet knew what the truth was, and none of them wanted to be the first to find out the hard way. Verthel Karst-on-Hollow's surviving men had told stories in the taverns of the Hollow Coast. The stories were wild. They contradicted each other. Some said the mountain had eaten the drillers. Some said a creature the size of a warship had risen from the borehole. Some said nothing at all, and just sat in the corner and drank. The 6 kingdoms were, for a brief and precious window, paralyzed by their own disbelief. And in that window, Eron and Lyra and the 3 dragons did the only thing they could think of. They prepared. Then, in the 3rd month, Verthel came back. He did not come alone. He had hired a man named Rowan Calix Thorn, a mercenary captain out of Old Bracken whose reputation Eron knew the way you know the name of a disease. Calix Thorn had 200 men, 6 siege ballistae modified for what the contract called large game capture, and a writ from a magistrate in the Free Cities authorizing the humane removal of what the writ called an unregistered apex specimen from Drakemoor for the purposes of scientific examination and public safety. The writ named Eron Thalveris by title and bloodline as the harboring party and authorized his detention pending investigation. Lyra saw the column coming up the southern road from the keep window. She turned to Eron, her face pale, and she said, "We have an hour, maybe 2. Eron sat at the kitchen table. He looked at his hands. He thought about Verthel's velvet collar. He thought about the writ. He thought about the way the 6 kingdoms would, when they heard about it, line up neatly behind whichever interpretation of events most flattered their own ambitions. He thought about his son, in the lowlands, growing up gentler than the world deserved. He thought about his grandmother's 3 words. And then he did something he had not done in 19 years. He went to the chamber on the eastern face. He stood at the mouth of it. He looked at the eldest dragon, the one with amber eyes the color of his own, and he spoke her name out loud for the first time in his life. The low sound that vibrated in his chest, the name his grandmother had made him memorize before he understood what memory was for. The dragon opened both eyes. She looked at him for a long time, and then, very slowly, she lowered her enormous head until her forehead was level with his. And Eron understood that she had been waiting for 140 years to be addressed by name. And he understood, with a small, slow horror, that he was going to have to flee his own mountain, because 200 men with siege ballistae were coming up the southern road, and if they reached the chamber, they would kill her. And he understood, finally, why his grandmother had told him to never use the names except when the mountain asked. Because to speak the name was to take responsibility. And he had just taken responsibility, and it was now, irrevocably, his. He took Lyra. He took the ledgers. He took the satchel her mother had pressed into her hands 3 months ago. And the 3 dragons, the amber one, and the bronze one, and the silver one, rose from the eastern face at dusk in a single, coordinated wing snap that bent the trees on the lower slope and was seen by witnesses in 5 of the 6 kingdoms simultaneously. And the news, at last, broke. By midnight, every court on the continent knew that the dragons of Drakemoor were not extinct. By dawn, every court knew that they answered to a single man. And by the second dawn, Every court was bidding for him. But Eron was not on the mountain. Eron and Lyra were 3 valleys west, hidden in an old shepherd's hut, reading a stack of letters that should not have existed. The letters had been delivered the previous evening by a woman who had walked out of the trees at sunset with gray hair and a satchel and the same amber eyes as Eron. Her name was Maren Ovelt Dre. She was a scholar in exile, she said. She had been excommunicated from the Royal Library of Vale 41 years ago for refusing to burn certain documents. She had spent 4 decades carrying those documents around the continent in a leather satchel. The documents were letters. The letters had been written by Eron Thalveris, Eron's grandmother. He read them by candlelight, with Lyra at one shoulder and Maren at the other, and his hands began to shake by the 3rd letter. Because what his grandmother had written, in careful, tight script on 41 pages of fading paper, was not a family history. It was a confession. And it was a warning. The Thalveris line, his grandmother wrote, was not a bloodline that had been chosen by chance to guard the dragons of Drakemoor. The Thalveris line had been engineered by the dragons themselves, generations before the founding of the 6 kingdoms. The dragons, before their long hibernation, had selected a human family for what reason Vesa never fully understood, though she suspected loneliness, and had subtly, over centuries, shaped its bloodline to produce, every few generations, an individual whose throat and tongue and inner ear could form and hear the dragon names. Eron was not a hereditary guardian. Eron was a hereditary translator. And the title Dragon Tamer was not a description of his power. It was a polite, human misunderstanding of his job. There was more. There was a 4th name. His grandmother had written it on the final page, in a script so small, Eron had to hold the candle directly above the paper to read it. She had not taught him this 4th name. She had decided, for reasons she explained in 2 careful paragraphs, that he should not carry it until he was old enough to choose to carry it. The 4th name belonged to no living dragon. The 4th name was a true name, an awakening name, a calling name. To speak it aloud was to summon the eldest of the eldest, the dragon who had designed the bloodline, the dragon who had chosen, alone, to remain in the deepest part of the chamber and continue sleeping when the other 3 rose. To speak the 4th name was to wake her. And to wake her was to be answerable to her for everything that had happened in the world during the 140 years she had been asleep. Eron looked up from the page. Lyra was crying, quietly, with her hand over her mouth. Maren was watching him with the calm patience of a woman who had been waiting 41 years to deliver these letters to a man who could read them. And outside, on the wind, very faint, Eron could hear horns. The horns of Rowan Calixthorne's column moving up the eastern road toward the village of Ashen-Hollow, where Lyra's mother lived, and where 17 people had once felt their teeth vibrate, and where the column would, by the laws of war and the writ of the free cities, be entirely entitled to take the village hostage in order to lure the harboring party, Eron, back to the mountain. He closed his grandmother's letters. He looked at Lyra. He looked at Maren, and he said the only sentence that mattered. __, quote, _25, __. But he did not go back alone. By the next morning, a 4th person had joined them. His name was Father Cassian Lorve. He was a healer priest of the Reachlands, and he had defected from his order the previous night because, he said, his order had received a sealed letter from a cartel of 6 monarchs, instructing all temples on the continent to declare Eron Thalveris a heretic on sight. He had read the letter. He had not delivered it. He had instead walked 70 miles in his sandals to find the man he was supposed to denounce, and he had arrived at the shepherd's hut with blistered feet and a calm face, and a sentence Eron would remember for the rest of his life. If 6 kings agree on a heresy, Father Cassian said, the heresy is usually a truth, and he asked, very politely, if he could come along. They called themselves the Wakers. Lyra named them. It was meant half as a joke. It stuck. Eron, the translator, Lyra, the witness, Meren, the scholar, Cassian, the healer. 4 people, 3 dragons hidden in the high passes above. A continent of 6 kingdoms turning, slowly, against them. And under it all, beneath every other consideration, the 4th name of Eron Thalveris' grandmother sitting at the back of Eron's throat like a stone. The next 2 months were a war that was not yet called a war. Calyx Thorn's column did exactly what Eron had feared. They occupied Ashen-Hollow. They did not harm anyone because the writ specifically forbade it, but they billeted in the houses, ate the food, took the horses from the stable where Lyra had worked, and waited for Eron to come down. Eron did not come down. Instead, the Wakers moved through the high passes, and the dragons followed at a distance, and Meren read aloud from Vessa's letters every night by the campfire, and Cassian set Lyra's twisted ankle when she fell on the 3rd week, and Eron began, slowly, to understand the shape of the trap closing around him. Because it was not just Verthel, it was not just Calyx Thorn. Behind both of them was something Vessa's letters had warned about on the 34th page. A coordinating body, a cartel. 6 monarchs who had, in absolute secrecy, met 4 years ago at a hunting lodge in the Reachlands and signed a private accord. The accord was called, in Vessa's letters, the Reach Concord. Its stated purpose was the __quote _28 __. Its actual purpose was the systematic, secret awakening, capture, and weaponization of every hibernating apex species the 6 kingdoms could locate. Drakemoor was not the only mountain. It was just the first one to wake up on its own. The leader of the Concord, Vessa had written in a hand that had begun on that page to shake. The leader of the Concord was a woman named Selene Merrick Vale. Vessa had met her once, in the year before her death, when Selene was a young diplomat. Vessa had described her in a single sentence Eron read 3 times. __quote _29 __. Selene was now, 40 years later, the senior coordinator of the Concord. And it was Selene, not Verthel, not Calyx Thorn, who had authorized the writ. And it was Selene, Eron understood with a slow, cold clarity, who would be the actual enemy of everything that happened next. The kingdoms moved first. In the 3rd month after the awakening, the Reach Concord declared, jointly, that the __quote _30 _ required a unified response. Calyx Thorn's 200 became 2,000. 6 anti-dragon ballistae became 36. The army moved on the mountain in midwinter, expecting Eron to be hiding among its peaks. He was not. He was, by then, standing on the highest ridge of Drakemoor, with Lyra at his left hand and Meren at his right, and Cassian behind him, and the 3 dragons coiled in the snow around them like a living wall, and the 4th name of his grandmother's last letter sitting at the back of his throat like a held breath. He had decided, 3 nights earlier, that he would speak the 4th name only if the army crossed into Ashen-Hollow's outer fields. He would not speak it for the mountain. He would not speak it for the dragons. He would speak it, if at all, for the 17 people whose teeth had vibrated on the day of the first breath. For Lyra's mother, who had pressed a small clay jar of honey into her daughter's hands without explanation 3 months ago, on a morning when the world was still ordinary. The army crossed into the outer fields at dawn. Eron Thalveris closed his eyes. He felt Lyra's hand find his. He felt the 3 dragons go very, very still around him. And he spoke the 4th name out loud, the way his grandmother had refused to teach it to him, the way she had written it in her smallest script on the last page of the last letter, the way she had hoped all her life that he would never have to. The mountain answered. I cannot describe to you, dear viewer, what came out of the deepest part of the chamber. Meren, in her ledger, wrote only 2 words, __quote _31 __Cassian. In his prayer journal wrote, quote 32. Lyra, in her witness notes, wrote a single sentence, quote 33. And the army of the Reach Concord, 2,000 men with 36 anti-dragon ballistae and a writ signed by 6 monarchs, stopped moving. Every single horse on the line refused to take another step. Every single man on the line looked up. And what they saw above the eastern face of Drakemoor in the pale winter light of a midwinter dawn was a creature so old that the 3 dragons coiled around Eron in the snow looked, by comparison, like her children. Because they were. The eldest of the eldest. The designer of the Thalveris bloodline. The dragon who had decided 140 years ago to sleep until a translator could find her name on the last page of a letter that her chosen human grandmother had refused to burn. She did not attack. She did not breathe fire. She did not, in fact, do anything that any of the histories or scholarly treatises on dragons had ever predicted a dragon would do. She simply unfolded her wings, slowly, against the winter sky, until the shadow of those wings covered the entire valley, and the army of 2,000 men and 36 ballistae was standing, very quietly, in a darkness the size of a small kingdom. And in that darkness, she made a single sound, not a roar, a note, low and long and grieving, and addressed, Eron understood with a small, cold shiver, not to the army, but to the 6 monarchs who were not present in the valley, but who, in their 6 separate throne rooms across the continent, looked up at exactly the same moment from their breakfasts and felt, in the base of their skulls, a pressure that they had never felt before and would never forget. The note said, in a language older than language, "I see you. I know your names. And I have decided, today, not yet." The army of the Reach Concord turned around. Calix Thorn, to his small credit, gave the order himself. The 36 ballistae were left in the snow. They were never recovered. Verthel Karst-on-Hollow was found, 4 days later, in his velvet collar, hanging from a beam in the small hunting lodge where the Reach Concord had been signed 4 years earlier. The official cause of death was suicide. Eron and Lyra did not believe that. Merrin wrote in her ledger that Selene Merrick Vale had simply removed an inconvenient witness. She was probably right. The treaty was signed 3 weeks later, in the courtyard of Eron's crumbling keep, with the snow still on the ground and the eldest of the eldest watching from the ridge above like a patient mountain. All 6 monarchs came in person. None of them spoke for the first hour. Eron stood in his patched coat, with Lyra at his left hand and Merrin at his right, and Cassian behind him, and the 3 dragons coiled in the snow around the courtyard, and he did the only thing his grandmother's letters had told him to do. He listened. He let the monarchs speak first. He let them propose. He let them apologize in the careful diplomatic way of people who have just discovered that the universe is larger than their kingdom. And then, when they had finished, he made a single demand. The Reach Concord was to be dissolved. Every other sealed chamber on the continent, and there were, by Merrin's reading of Vessa's letters, at least 11 of them, was to be left alone, untouched, unwoken, until and unless the apex inside requested, through a translator of its own bloodline, to be woken. The monarchs agreed. They signed. The treaty was witnessed, on the bottom of the page, by a paw print the size of a cartwheel, pressed by the eldest of the eldest into the wax. 6 kingdoms bowed, together for the first time in living memory, not to Eron, to what stood behind him. That evening, after the monarchs had gone, after the ballistae had been buried in the snow, after Cassian had blessed the courtyard and Merrin had filed her letters and the 3 dragons had returned to the high passes to sleep, Eron and Lyra sat at the kitchen table of the crumbling keep with a single tallow candle between them, and they ate a small meal of bread and dried apples and honey from the clay jar her mother had pressed into her hands 4 months and a lifetime ago. Neither of them spoke for a long time. The candle burned low. The wind moved against the shutters. And finally, Lyra reached across the table and took his hand, the way she had on that first night by the mouth of the chamber, and she said, very quietly, "Eron said," she said. And dear viewer, I want you to hold this image. A weathered man in a patched coat, a 19-year-old stable girl, a single candle, a jar of honey, a treaty signed by 6 kingdoms drying in the next room, and outside, on the highest ridge of a mountain that the world had believed was empty, an ancient creature folding her wings against the winter stars. Because this is the picture you take with you when you leave this episode. This is what victory looks like, when victory is also the beginning of a longer responsibility. Eron Thalveris was no longer the man who guarded an empty mountain. He was the schedule of the old powers. He had united 6 kingdoms, and he had, in doing so, agreed to be available for the rest of his mortal life to interpret the requests of beings who measured time in centuries. He understood, sitting at that table, that he would not see his son grow old. He understood that Lyra, who was 19, would outlive him by decades and would carry the witness ledgers to whoever came next. He understood that his grandmother, on her deathbed 19 years earlier, had been protecting him not from danger, but from this exact bargain. That she had taught him 3 names so that he would be ready, and withheld the 4th so that he would be free, for as long as possible, to choose not to use it. He had used it. The bargain was struck, and he was, in the deepest sense, at peace with it. He raised the clay jar of honey slightly in a small, private toast to a woman in the lowlands who had pressed it into her daughter's hands without explanation on an ordinary morning. And the candle burned down, and the wind moved against the shutters, and the night, for the first time in 140 years on Drakemoor Peaks, was not empty. But somewhere very far to the south, dear viewer, in a small stone room in a coastal city that the treaty did not yet reach, a woman named Selene Merrick Vale was sitting at a desk with a single object in front of her. The object was an egg. It was not a chicken's egg. It was not a dragon's egg. It was the size of a melon. It was the color of a sigh. And as she watched, in the low light of her single lamp, a hairline crack opened across its shell, and a small, slow sound came out of it. The sound was not the sound of a dragon. The sound was older. The sound was the kind of sound that the eldest of the eldest had been sleeping for 140 years to avoid having to hear. Selene did not smile. Selene did not move. Selene simply opened a small leather notebook on her desk, picked up a pen, and wrote, in careful, tight script that would have been, if anyone had been there to compare them, almost identical to the script of Vesa Thalveris' last letters. It is beginning. And under the southern sea, dear viewer, in a trench so deep that no human ship had ever crossed it, something answered. If you have made it this far, you understand what has just happened. Eron Thalveris woke the dragons. The dragons did not save the world. They were the world's first warning. The thing that is hatching in Selene's stone room and the thing that is stirring under the southern sea, these are what the dragons were sleeping to be ready for. And Eron, the translator, the interpreter, the man who guarded an empty mountain for 19 years on the promise of a dying grandmother, has just, by uniting 6 kingdoms, given them their last and only chance to survive what is coming next. In episode 18, Selene Merrick Vale takes the cracked egg into the trench beneath the southern sea. In episode 18, the eldest of the eldest does not return to her chamber on Drakemoor. In episode 18, the Wakers learn that they are not, in fact, 4, that there are translators in other bloodlines, in other countries, who have been waiting, like Eron, for someone to find them. And in episode 18, the man who wakes the old powers begins to understand that he has not united the kingdoms against an enemy, he has united them as a schedule of who is woken next, by whom, for what reason, and at what price. Subscribe to RiseArc for daily sagas of forgotten heroes, hidden bloodlines, and worlds that wake up too late. Like this episode if you felt the moment the mountain answered. Comment with the name of the dragon you would want to be addressed by if your grandmother had whispered 3 sounds beside your bed when you were 9 years old. And remember, dear viewer, the line that this entire saga turns on and that will return in different forms in every episode that follows: extinction is sometimes only a long sleep, and someone eventually remembers the name.